I think the word was like mirror opposites that you guys use. And so I wrote this thing because I thought about the similarity between a mirror and a wet plate photograph that I'd never thought about. That you work with these wet plates, and it's this fragile plane of glass with silver on the back of this thing. And the difference between that and the mirror is just varying degrees of silver. And you see what you may or may not want to see, because both can be inconvenient in this way. But unlike the mirror, the image held in the emulsion that you make in that wet plate photograph invites you to look through it like a window, to look through the image, with the image, and see life, shaped, framed, clouded, and obscured by a landscape of memory. In your book, you invite us to look through that window on this life private made public, seen from this window of a life spent not just in, but a life spent with photography. Please welcome Sally Mann.
Thanks. Thank you. So I'm going to just read very, very quickly from this book, Hold Still. And my editor just kind of cherry-picked a few passages from the part of the book that talks about my childhood and adolescence, starting with chapter 3, The Bending Arc. As many people have remarked, I am lucky to have found Larry Mann when I did. Whether I was born this way or my personality was formed by circumstance, I don't think anyone would call me an easy person to deal with. And by the time our paths crossed, the hormones of the teen years had only made things worse. I had been a near feral child, raised not by wolves, but by the 12 boxer dogs that my father kept around Boxerwood, the honeysuckle strangled and darkly mysterious 30-acre property where I grew up. The story of my intractability has been told and retold to me all my life by my elders, usually accompanied by a friendly little cheek pinch and a sympathetic glance over at my mother. Recently, in tracking down stories about Virginia Carter, the black woman who worked for my family for nearly 50 years, I visited Jane Alexander, a 96-year-old, who repeated to me in a soft voice with a bobby pin twang to it, the now familiar tale of my refusal to wear a stitch of clothing until I was 5. Family snapshots seem to bear this out. I know that my mother tried to raise me properly, but I made her cross as 2 sticks, so she turned the day-to-day care of her stroppy, unruly child over to Virginia, known to everyone as Gigi, a name given her by my eldest brother, Bob. Jane Alexander reminded me about the beautiful, often handmade dresses that Gigi would lovingly press for me in hopes that they would soften my resolve to live as a dog. I have them still, pristine and barely worn. If my early years sound a bit like those legends of wolf-teeth sucklers, I guess they were. But all the same, when I compare the lives of children today, monitored, protected, medicated, and overscheduled, to my own unsupervised, dirty, boring childhood, I believe I had the better deal. I grew up into the person I am today, for better or worse, on those lifeless summer afternoons, having doggy adventures that took me far from home, where no one had looked for me or missed me in the least. Looking back, though, it could be that my parents were a bit on the less than diligent side, even for the times. Once, when I was with my mother in the dry goods section of Leggett's department store, we saw the distinctive going-to-town hat worn by Mrs. Hinton bobbing above the bolts of cloth. She was the mother of my brother Bob's best friend, Billy Hinton. When she saw my mother, she brightened and said, "Oh, Billy just received a postcard from Bob. Apparently he loves his new school." My mother, rubbing some velveteen between forefinger and thumb, responded distractedly, "Oh, that's good. We hoped he'd gotten there okay." Turns out that 10 days before, my parents had packed a steamer trunk full of warm clothes for my 15-year-old brother and driven him to the Lynchburg, Virginia train station. After 8 hours on the Lynchburg train, he had to change stations in New York. My parents told him to carry his trunk from Penn Station to Grand Central and to locate the overnight train to a town near the Putney School, the Vermont boarding school he was to attend. Then they left him and apparently never wondered if those connections had worked for the boy, who had not traveled alone before, or even if he had made it to Putney at all. They had heard nothing since dropping him off and had never called the school to check. My mother told the story countless times, laughing gaily at her recollection of Mrs. Hinton's shock. The assumption back then in the palmy post-war Eisenhower years in America was that everything was fine now, and that was true for the most part. I think my parents were fairly untroubled by child-rearing issues, except for the constant battles over clothing, their stubborn hoyden. My father called me Jaybird because I was that naked. But eventually, even that was solved by the arrival in 1956 of Mr. Coffey's carpentry crew, there to build a cottage for my grandmother Jessie on the property. My mother proposed a deal. If I wanted to hang out with the carpenters, I had to wear clothes of some sort. I was so lonely, I took it. Even though I finally agreed to wear clothing, I had some difficulty working out the details, as my mother's exasperated journal entries report. Sally is in a towering rage in her room because I won't let her go to play school with tattered and dirty underpants instead of the clean ones. Her turn to create a ruckus. I'm firm and calm at present, but I'm about to blow up myself. Despite being kicked out several times for not wearing any underwear, never mind tattered and dirty, a few mornings a week I began to attend Mrs. Lackman's preschool, where I worked on my socialization skills. By springtime, I had managed to make some human friends whose parents drove them out to my house for a birthday party presided over by Gigi. By the time I began real school, I was almost normal. I no longer spent my days poking at snapping turtles in the pond or hiding out with my grubby blanket in the honeysuckle caves or following my unneutered beagle on his amorous adventures down the paved road from which, when I was hungry, I would pull stringy hot tar to chew like gum. I now wore crinolines, little white socks, and gauzy dresses. There's a little gap here in time, and we move ahead to my teenage years. On the weekends, I would head off with my date in his Chevelle or El Camino, my hair rat's nested and lacquered into ringlets atop my heavily made-up face, eyelashes curled and matted with mascara, heavy black lines drawn across and well past my eyelid in a Cher-like Cleopatra imitation, lips shiny with cheap lipstick, jungle gardenia flowering at my throat, on my wrists, and between my A-cup breasts, which did their best to swell out of a padded bra. I would generally heave in pretty close to my absolute curfew so as not to enrage my punctilious father unduly, and find my parents serenely sitting on the couch in the living room. My mother, with her stockinged legs tucked beneath her, would be wreathed in blue cigarette smoke, deep in the New Yorker or Harper's. My father, a well-sharpened yellow pencil in hand, would be reading with pointy intensity some scholarly paper or plant catalog from the Far East and wouldn't deign to raise his eyes. Stripping off her reading glasses, my mother would squint through the smoke at me with vague confusion, as though an unexpected stranger had just appeared. Weaving slightly, I would stand not in front of them, but off to the side, as if eager to head down the hall to my bedroom to get some last-minute studying done. My hair, trailing bobby pins, would be matted and tendrilled against my hickey-spotted neck, and the skirt of my dress would be wrinkled, the taupe toes of pantyhose peeking out from my purse. My swollen lips were now a natural, chapped red, and my cheeks blushed with beard burn. Peering over the angry marks to either side of her nose left by her glasses, my mother, studying the stone fireplace 4 feet behind me, would ask casually, "Oh, did you have a nice time, dear?" Really, what choice did they have but to send me away to school? My brothers, 9 and 7 years older than me, were hectoring them to send me to Putney. which they both attended and loved. Even I knew on some level that I needed to get out of the high school world whose horizon stopped at cheerleader tryouts and drag races on the bypass. Ray Goodlatte, the admissions director at Putney, must have waived a few of their policies to get me in. In a pattern that has remained constant all of my life, my verbal scores were in the 99th percentile, but, oh God, were my math scores abysmal, and my high school grades were only so-so, not always on the honor roll anymore. Most of the kids at Putney were sophisticated children of urban intellectuals with good scores and good grades, fewer than 20% from below the Mason-Dixon line. Not one would have known, as I did, what a whomping a 4-on-the-floor GTO could give a barracuda in the quarter mile on the bypass. So in September of 1967, my mother packed me and my brass-cornered trunk, the same one that my brother Bob had lugged from station to station in New York, into her powder blue Rambler station wagon, and we set off for Vermont. Halfway there, the car blew a head gasket and died, so we rented a much newer car. In it, as we pulled up to White Cottage, my new dorm, I unknowingly enjoyed the last moment of personal confidence that I was to feel for a long time. The first week, I raised my hand in Hepper Caldwell's history class and asked what a Jew was. Hepper, we were allowed to call our teachers by their first names, though startled, refrained from making fun of me, but no such luck from the rest of the class, many of whom were Jews. I was the most ridiculed minority of all, a dumb cracker with a trunk full of very uncool, reversible wraparound skirts my mother had sewn herself, Clark's desert boots with crepe soles from Talbot's, and variably sized pink foam hair rollers. Nobody at Putney had hydrogen peroxide blonde hair teased into a beehive. Nobody at Putney wore makeup, and nobody at Putney listened to the Righteous Brothers or wore her boyfriend's leather sweater and heavy class ring, its band wrapped with dirty adhesive tape. Skipping ahead to chapter 4, The Family of Mann. After Putney and a wayward summer writing poetry and taking pictures in Mexico, I enrolled at Bennington College, figuring it would be pretty much the same as Putney, 48 miles away. I wasn't any fonder of being way up north, but it was a known quantity as opposed to Sarah Lawrence or Barnard, schools that I decided were too urban for me. Flying the familiar route on Piedmont Airlines to tiny Weirs Cave Airport, I arrived home for Christmas in 1969 and finally met Larry, 3 months after our destiny, unbeknownst to us, had been sealed on the afternoon he moved the epic stone. You'll have to read the book to get that story. The farmhouse where my Lexington boyfriend lived had an odd layout, and one night, as I slouched in a satanically bad mood on the edge of his bed, Larry walked through the room to the shared bathroom. I had no idea who he was. He did not so much as glance in my direction, but my eyes followed him with a warm, glittering interest. We were married 6 months later. Let me skip ahead just a bit. You'd never know it by looking at the parents' allocation of resources and time, but there were 2 sons in the Mann family, Larry and Chad, 2 years younger. The Manns had chosen to concentrate their efforts on Larry, probably because of his exceptional good looks, tractability, and general social ease. Directly inside the front door of their home was a large gilt frame painting of Larry the equestrian, executed in the fawning style of an Ancien Regime court artist. Nowhere in the house was there any sign that there was another child in the family, no pictures or trophies or framed diplomas. Chad also came in for physical abuse by his mother, but he surmises that because he wore glasses, he didn't get the hard facial slaps that sent Larry to school with his ears ringing and reddened, and instead got just the spoon and the brush. Except for the beatings, Chad was basically ignored, which in a way was a blessing. The man zeroed in on the horse world as the best place to show off their handsome son and to make contacts with the right kind of people. Every afternoon after school, Larry was picked up by his mother in a Mustang convertible, her bouffant covered by an Hermes scarf, and driven to Ox Ridge Hunt Club for intensive lessons in dressage and jumping by their top instructors. In fact, he loved horses and riding, even ring work and the fancy horse shows. Like me, he found time on a horse transcendent and healing in some way, but especially the less structured disciplines, playing polo, fox hunting, or occasionally just galloping on the cinder paths that lined the fields. While his mother drank martinis at the club bar, Larry hung out with the forbidden groom underclass and realized all the more clearly the trap into which he had been born. But even into his late teens, he remained pliant, escorting the daughters of the rich to balls at the Ritz, while with the avidity of a Spanish conqueror seeking Inca gold, his mother scoured the hunt clubs and society pages for just the right wealthy daughter-in-law. The girl Larry brought home in spring 1970 was far from meeting any of their criteria. "She goes to Bennington?" they had asked incredulously, responding to the news of our romance as if he had found me in a leper colony outside of Baton Rouge. Implacably, Larry said yes. Bending to his unexpected defiance, they offered a grudging invitation for me to visit. When Larry and I arrived over Easter, his mother placed a Lily Pulitzer outfit on the bed in my room as an alternative to my 501s and fry boots. I decided right there that she was a ring-tailed yard bitch. The feeling was clearly mutual. At the midday Easter dinner, when we announced we were going to get married in 6 weeks, his parents and grandparents burst into tears and left the table. We looked over at Chad, who raised an eyebrow and smiled, then, spooning mint jelly onto his plate, continued eating. We did the same, and that night, Larry crossed from his bedroom to mine, and we made noisy love before leaving at dawn. We found out later that after that week, his parents made an appointment with their lawyer to cut Larry out of their will. Their disapproval only increased our determination and the perverse pleasure we took in our unacceptable love. The preparations for the wedding were easy. We bought 2 simple gold rings at Ed Levin's shop in Bennington, and I designed a demure cotton dress that I had a local seamstress stitch up. My father dusted off his Linhof and shot a few pictures, one of which Larry's parents grudgingly put in the New Canaan newspaper. I had a vision of how I wanted to live. In 1969, my parents and I had visited Helen and Scott Nearing on their subsistence farm in Maine, and I had made a heavily underscored mental note that this was exactly what I wanted for myself: a life of simplicity, pluck, seclusion, and soul-satisfying, ecological, sweat-of-the-brow, we'll vote with our lives, self-sufficiency. 7 years later, Larry and I were giving it a go. By 1977, we were digging by hand the footers for an impossibly perilous cliff dwelling, and then for the next half-decade, we scavenged building materials for it, learning as we went. By the time Cy, and here we're talking about Cy Twombly, this is a chapter about him. By the time Cy moved back to Lexington in 1993, the resultant spindly, hand-built, Rube Goldberg-like passive solar house had bulked up with a succession of shed-roofed add-ons, living areas cantilevered out over the abyss, and labyrinthine porches covered with vines. A commercial pilot we know once remarked that from the air, our house resembled those shanty towns on the edge of the Mexico City dump, and we were not offended. It was a totally cool, Big Surish house, impractical, whimsical, not to code in any respect, the kind of place that stopped passers-by in their tracks and lured them, cautious and curious, past the basilisk sculptures to our slabwood front door. Cy, too, would wander down from the warehouse to that door, calling out in his distinctive, hesitant voice, "Sally, are you receiving?" We both liked to sit out on the wisteria-covered back deck overlooking the creek, especially on those sultry summer nights when the fog rose from the bottomland and wisped among the racemes of white bloom. One such night found a group of us with Cy and Nicola, his gentle, erudite companion, sitting after a late dinner on that porch, the newspaper-covered table nacreous with oyster shells, bottles of wine darkening the center. I mentioned my past fascination with Ezra Pound, an American who, like Cy, had found Italy his place, quote, for starting things, and about whom I had written my master's thesis. At this, Cy, sitting to my right at the head of the table, leaned over to me with a look of confidence about to be divulged, so I pressed close. When Cy was about to tell a story or make a naughty quip, he would cover his mouth in a schoolchild's way, fingertips lightly touching his primly pursed lips, while above them the eyes were alight and impish. I watched memory veil those eyes as he spoke of a time in the late 1960s when he and Nicola had been invited to the LOOK3 Festival by its founder, Giancarlo Menotti. That evening, a Russian pianist was performing, and Menotti honored Cy and Nicola by seating them in his private balcony in the Opera Theater. As they took their seats, they were startled to see behind them Ezra Pound and Olga Rudge, one of the three women with whom Pound had simultaneous relationships. Cy described Pound as having an aura, a mystical appearance, and as being somehow set apart from regular people. Nicola wrote me later that Pound, quote, acted extremely shy, like only a northern blonde child could be. He hardly looked at us, and in a side way. Telling me of this in the humid summer night, Cy emphasized how rare it was to see the reclusive poet who seldom appeared in public in those later years. Pound had been driven mad, or perhaps more mad, by his wartime incarceration in Pisa for treason. It was there, locked up like an animal in a 6 by 6.5 foot cage, that he began writing on a piece of toilet paper the uneven but brilliant Pisan cantos. Interestingly, housed in the cage next to him was Emmett Till's father, Lewis, until he was hanged, quote, for murder and rape with trimmings, as Pound put it. After Pound began to show clear signs of a mental breakdown, he was shipped from Pisa back to the United States and confined to the bug house at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. A decade after his release in 1958, Pound stopped speaking altogether. Much was made of his self-imposed silence, and it has always been reported that not a single word ever passed his lips once he began it. Except, to their amazement, Cy and Nicola heard Pound speak to Olga. They both described it as the whispering of a deeply wounded and suspicious man, but also of a man fading out of this life. Cy said he would have loved to have exchanged just one word with this intransigent, mysterious, wrong-headed, brilliant man. Instead, he and Nicola somehow maintained a posture of intense interest in the music played before them, arcing backwards in their seats, hoping to hear the thoughts of a genius. Imagine that, on my peckerwood porch, late in the humid, cloyingly fragrant Virginia night, Cy, in a Pound-like whisper, tells a story I found marvelous in the many improbable threads it wove together. That he had heard Ezra Pound, the author of the lines written on my father's memorial stone, with whom I held a long fascination, and that within this tale was another of my long-held fascinations, Emmett Till. And of course, that the storyteller was Cy, the local hero, come back to sit in the dung-heap-turned garden that was our home, the prodigal returning to Lexington. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.